Welcome to the Southern Medicine Podcast, where we explore the unique healthcare challenges affecting the quality of patient care across the southeastern United States.
Well, hello. I'd like to just welcome our special guest today, Dr. Jeffery Smith. I'm Richard Leggett. I'm currently serving as the co-chair for the Educational Committee for SMA, and we're happy to welcome Dr. Smith for this edition of Smart Bites. Today, we're going to talk on the topic of medical writing therapy, and particularly how writing therapy can be useful for physicians as a means of coping with stress and with expressing themselves, and for other reasons that just give personal satisfaction. So today we are very honored to have a native of the great state of Alabama, who is also a graduate of the University of Alabama, both undergraduate and with a medical degree. And he has been trained in the great state of South Carolina and currently practices there. And for the last 30 plus years, he has been practicing as a psychiatrist, but he's also been very busy doing a very important and very interesting side job. He has become an accomplished author. And so I want to recognize Dr. Smith, and for here forward, we'll just call him Jeff, and you can call me Richard, and we'll just talk a little bit about what writing therapy is all about and how Dr. Smith has exemplified one way of going about that. So, Jeff, could you just kind of start us? I know you finished your residency around 1990, and I think your first book came out about 1999. So how did you get interested in writing, and how did things go from the end of residency up until that first book?
Well, I think most writers will tell you that they're voracious readers, number one, and I have been since my childhood, and have always kind of dabbled in writing. Even growing up, I wrote some short stories. I wrote some mock sports columns. Those are perhaps mercifully in a box in the attic somewhere where I can't find now. And in college, I minored in English and was very close to having a second minor in history. And I have no other artistic abilities. I can't sing, I can't play an instrument, I can't paint. But I found that I can paint pictures with words, and that may be my true artistic calling. And it's never really a job to me. Writing is, don't get me wrong, it's hard work, but it's a hobby for me. It's something I look forward to doing as much as I would enjoy watching an Alabama football game or playing golf or something. I savor the opportunities to do it. So it's nothing like work.
That's great. What was it that kind of got you to the point? I know it took almost a decade between finishing residency, getting established in practice, and then starting to actually publish. Can you kind of walk us through how that process happened to get out your first book, which I just wanted to mention that you've actually been accomplished in two different genres of writing, and the first three books were a trilogy of medical mysteries. I want you to kind of tell us a little bit about that, how that started, and then how you kind of shifted gears to more the history-related book.
Well, the first, as you mentioned, my first three books were a murder mystery trilogy involving a forensic psychiatrist. And I sort of remembered I'm paraphrasing here, but the late William Faulkner always said, when you're writing about fiction, write about that which you know. And being a psychiatrist was what I knew. And that really got me very interested in doing that. And, there was about a 9-year gap from finishing residency till my first book was published. A lot of that time was studying and taking the board exams, trying to build a practice, helping my wife raise two young children. So that filled much of that time. Now, I actually began writing a bit before 1999. I had my first book with a agent for a couple of years and really could not uh, get a mainstream publishing house to uh, agree to publish my manuscript. And around that time is when the self-publishing industry began, and I decided, well, this is not my career, and not what's going to generate my retirement income. It's not really my job. It's an avocation. So I decided to self-publish, and I've used a number of different companies through the years. And so part of that was no writing. I probably picked back up with the writing roughly 1997 and had a book with an agent, and then finally self-published that first manuscript. And then I did wrote two more not fiction books in the Sam Mitchell trilogy. And then I decided that I wanted to kind of return to my great love of history and like historical narratives. And yeah, I had my first historical narrative, Rendezvous in Dallas, which recounts the events of November 22nd through November 25th, 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated. And wrote that, I call it Rendezvous in Dallas because I wrote it from the perspective of four people's lives who were changed in less than 10 seconds. President Kennedy was killed. Vice President Lyndon Johnson was elevated from relative obscurity to the presidency. Lee Harvey Oswald became a social misanthropic misfit to someone who will occupy the pages of history forever. Jack Ruby went from a nightclub manager to being the assassin's assassin, and gaining notoriety was on in the history books, and how all four of these lives came together, and in the space of less than 10 seconds, the history of the United States, if not the world, was changed. Americans lost really a sense of collective innocence on that day. Television became the most prominent way of disseminating news that week, and prior to that, print media dominated, but television covered that weekend nonstop without commercial breaks for the first time in history, and it really overtook the print media as being the number one source of news. So there's so many things that happened with that weekend, and if you meet, and I have met through the years, a subset of the population who lived through three major events in life, and every one of those people could tell me exactly what they were doing when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. They could tell me exactly what they were doing when they heard President Kennedy was assassinated. And they could tell me exactly what they were doing when the 9/11 terrorist attacks occurred. So I put the Kennedy assassination with really three of the most traumatic events in 20th century, early 21st century American history.
That seems to be a lot going on, and a great place to start. How did you go from the first book to deciding on the order of the next several? Because one thing that really struck me is the wide range of different topics and different people that you've written about in historical events. So, I can say for my own that I remember exactly where I was when the 9/11 towers fell. I was at the hospital, and I walked past one of the patient lounges, and I saw the second airplane hit the second tower. And, I'll never, ever forget that. I was alive when the Kennedy assassination happened, but I think both of us were probably still in diapers about that time, but I don't have a lot of recollection of those. But what are some of the other things, Jeff, that kind of guided you in making some of those choices as you continue to develop this Bringing History Alive series? Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. They were kind of, and I can't remember now the exact order of publication of my books. I can be fairly general in doing that, but among the next two books were kind of offshoots from the topic we've been talking about. Bad Lyndon B. Johnson, Robert F. Kennedy, and the tumultuous 1960s were an offshoot of Rendezvous in Dallas, because I developed both of those characters to some degree in Rendezvous in Dallas, but as I learned more about the dynamics of their relationship and their absolute contempt for each other, and how so many decisions they made in their political life were based upon antagonizing the other party, that I thought it would make for a great dual biography, and also a very good synopsis of the 1960s, which I think is one of the most fascinating decades in American history. And then if people talk about remembering Pearl Harbor, if they were of a certain age, and late parents being of that age, and aunts and uncles, all of them are now deceased. They've all told me as a child vivid stories of what they were doing on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, when they heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor. So that led me into thinking about World War II and how World War II finally came to an end. And I'd really never read a comprehensive book that discussed the entire Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb, all the way through the testing of the atomic bomb, as you may have seen in the recent movie Oppenheimer, and the actual dropping of the two bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that was a very fascinating book too. And then from that point forward, I looked for interesting characters in history. And I don't necessarily have to like someone to write about. A lot of people I've written about, I don't particularly like. And if writers only wrote about the people they like and admire, we wouldn't have any biographies of Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin. So what I try to do is, okay, this person intrigues me. Let me read everything I can find that's been written about them. What I don't like to do is what we call a Me Too book. I don't want to write something that just because I want to write it, and I wanted to be able to add to the historical knowledge and literary base for that person or that topic. And most of the people that I've written about, some have been, very little's been written about. Some, a good bit's been written about. But a lot of those books were so much like history books, just dry as dust, that unless you were a really history nerd like I am, the average reader would just put down after less than 50 pages. Some of the other books were well written and entertaining, but hopelessly inaccurate in details about that person's life. So my goal was to try to write a factual narrative, but also make it read like a novel, to engage people, to entertain and to educate. And that's where I came up with the moniker Bringing History Alive, to get these are narratives. They're not filled with endnotes and footnotes. They're not designed for academic historians, but for everyday readers who perhaps want to learn more about historical figures and historical events. And if you can engage them in a writing style that they don't want to put the book down, I think you accomplished your task. And
Can I interrupt you just for a second? Because I just want to give a testimony that is what really struck me so much about your books. And just to give a little bit of backstory, the very first one that I heard about, I think you had sent me a notice about the book on Buford Lawley. And I really don't know a whole lot about Alabama history, but I've learned a tremendous amount by reading your book. And just like you said, they don't read like a textbook. They read like a novel. They have lots and lots of detail, but it's in a way that you don't want to put them down. And knowing that, knowing the author has helped me to kind of understand your style, because I having worked with you for 4 years, I kind of know a little bit about kind of how you see things, but it's really taught me a lot more about you as a writer, but also the circumstances and the history, particularly some of the subjects that you picked as far as Alabama figures and some of the South Carolina ones. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
well, of course, having lived my entire life in the South, I've been shaped by Southern culture, and for better or worse, the South has produced more than its share of colorful and controversial figures, whether it be George Wallace, Lyndon Johnson, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Big John Folsom. It would be very, very difficult for me to create a fictional character that was as colorful and controversial as Big Jim Folsom was, yet someone who was so progressive in their thinking for that era. That was absolutely a fascinating book to write. And the book about my hometown, A Lingering Evil, that was a very personal book for me. That murder of an innocent gas station attendant who was plunged to death in the middle of the night in January of 1968 was the first time that, I guess, evil had really invaded my innocent small town Alabama life. And that murder really had never left me, in the fact that it still remains a cold case murder. Every time I've returned to my hometown and I drive by that area, the gas station where the murder occurred has been since raised, but that thought has always come back to me. And I always wanted to write a little bit about what it was like growing up in small town Alabama. So let me share a little bit about myself and my upbringing and how I became motivated to write that book. And we'll never know who committed the murder. I can't say that for certain, but I think I shined a pretty focused beam on who I believe was indeed responsible for doing that.
Well, as far as some of the other folks, I mean, you mentioned George Wallace and Jim Folsom. There are a few others from Alabama or with Alabama ties, and several from South Carolina, like Strom Thurmond and Robert Small. So you want to talk a little bit about how you got interested in those topics?
Sure. Well, some of it goes back to the advice from Faulkner. I write about that, which, I have lived a substantial portion of my life in Alabama, but more in South Carolina now. So I was writing about people and events that I've studied in history, both growing up in Alabama and as an adult in South Carolina. Again, the fact that the South produces very colorful characters. And I do the vast majority of my book signings in either South Carolina or Alabama. And probably my widest readership is in those two states. So some of it has been to appeal to very loyal readers, to bring back a subject that let's say if you live in Alabama and you have a semi-interest in history, and you have a choice between reading the biography of Franklin Pierce, who lived in New Hampshire, or you have the choice of reading biography of George Wallace or being Jim Folsom, that you may either remember or you've had stories told down to you through the generations. That makes you more compelled to want to read and learn more about that. My best-selling book was Lingering Eagle, written in my hometown. Well, 99% of those copies were sold in the state of Alabama, because that's not a story that's necessarily going to appeal to people from really outside of my home county, unless you're really a true crime aficionado or cold case historian. And with Robert Smalls, it's interesting. That is the first time that I did not come up with this subject myself. My eldest son, who's 29, was a second grade school teacher. And he said, "Dad, you need to write about Robert Smalls, not because of his daring escape from slavery, but because he, as a South Carolina state legislator, was responsible for introducing legislation that allowed South Carolina to have the first mandated public education system in the United States." And having lived here for 4 years, you know very well that South Carolina does not rank number one in many progressive things throughout the course of history.
But in addition to the geographical emphasis, one other thing I noticed about some of the books is, seems like you like writing about presidents. Is there a particular reason for that?
Well, I've always been intrigued by both presidents. I've also been intrigued by presidential assassinations and the mindset of assassins. Those are two things that, if I said, okay, what are the top two topics in history I've read and studied the most about, it would be the American presidency, and then the assassinations of 4 presidents, the attempted assassinations of other presidents, and then assassinations of other prominent figures such as Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. So that's really where that interest came from. And some of the lesser known presidents, like Andrew Johnson, that I wrote about in The Loyalists, and James Buchanan, A Prelude to War. If you look at surveys by most professional historians, they rank Buchanan as the worst president ever, and Johnson's the second worst. So that really stimulated my thinking, okay, were they really that bad, or do they just happen to be the bookends to Abraham Lincoln, who's regarded as perhaps the greatest president of the United States? So trying to find that untold story and find out the truth was somewhere in between. Yes, both those presidents had a great disadvantage of preceding and then succeeding a legend, but they also had character faults. They also had the lack of capability to withstand the pressure that many of our great presidents have done. So it's trying to bring, I guess, some of the more obscure figures that I think we all need to know more about, particularly given the political situation we're in now in a presidential year, and the word that, this would be my word, the debacle of a presidential debate that I watched last night belongs me for the day of a true statesman and younger statesmen who have the mental and physical energy to, affect progressive policy.
You mentioned that the book about the hometown murder definitely stands alone in the series, but the other book that stood out to me as kind of a standalone was the book about Buddy Holly. Can you tell us about how you got interested in that, a non-political figure, but certainly a controversial one, and someone who had an impact on music, not just in the 50s, but on since then?
Well, I can remember that very clearly. And Buddy Holly died in 1959, a year before I was born, and really did not have that much knowledge growing up about him. And then in the December of 1971, Don McLean released American Pie, which went to number one on the top 40 and stayed there for several weeks in early 1972. And I was still 11 years old, but sophisticated enough to realize this is a complex story he's telling. And I mean, there actually have been at least a couple of books that have been written about American Pie by music historians, just general historians, about representations that analogies he uses in that song. So when I first bought that album and saw it was dedicated to Buddy Holly, I said, this is an impressive song. If he dedicated it to Buddy Holly, this Buddy Holly must have been a pretty impressive person. So I began then to try to find out more about Buddy Holly, which was not really that easy to do in small town Alabama in the era many, many years before the internet, when your best reference was the Encyclopedia Britannica. But I read everything I could, and then I began to buy albums and 8-track tapes and cassette tapes and CDs as we progressed in technology. And just always noticed that no matter how bad I felt when I played a Buddy Holly song, I smiled. And I read as much as I could about him and realized how much of a creative genius he was, how absolutely prolific he was, and what amounted to only an 18-month career, as he died in the early 1920s in a tragic plane crash in Iowa. So at that point, I wanted to learn as much as I could about him. And it's the most enjoyable book I've ever penned. It's also the hardest book I've ever penned because, I know when I hear a song, I know maybe I like it because of the melody, or I like it because of the lyrics. I'm a huge fan of singer-songwriters, but I'm not a musician. I can't read music. I can't play an instrument. So I had to go through a huge learning curve writing that book, and I had to elicit the help from some people that are far more learned, particularly songwriters and guitar players, to educate me about music. I had to rely on some aviation experts to help me better understand how that tragic plane crash occurred, and the circumstances prior to that, and why the plane crashed. And, it was really a neat experience because, I got to do a lot of traveling with that book. I went to Clear Lake, Iowa, and surf ballroom, sit on stage where Buddy Holly played his last concert, which was a very surreal experience for me because I lived Buddy Holly for about 9 months at that point in time. Also went to the plane crash site where there's a memorial marker. I went to Lubbock, Texas, his hometown. I was privileged enough to talk to and interview some of his contemporaries, including the late Peggy Sue Gerron, who was the from whom the song Peggy Sue became the name, and just made some very interesting connections, and I met some really neat people. And the last thing I'll say about Buddy Holly is that he was not only a talented songwriter, musician, singer, he did things that had never been done before in music, like overdubbing before there was computerized technology. but moreover, he was simply a nice guy. And that is not necessarily the first term you associate with many people in the entertainment.
Well, before we kind of shift gears a little bit and talk more about generally, writing therapy, I just have a few kind of short hitting questions about some of your top ones and just your favorites. So, what would you say was the easiest book that you ever wrote?
The easiest would be Rendezvous in Dallas because I've had really a long-standing, as I said, interest in assassinations and particularly assassination of John F. Kennedy. There have now been between 1,500 and 2,000 books that have been written about the Kennedy assassination. In fact, more words have been written about assassination of JFK than have been written about Jesus Christ. So I had researched that on my own, really without at first thinking about doing a book because so many had been done. But that was very easy for me because I spent hours in Dallas, Texas. I went to the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository with 4-power binoculars so I could get a feel for what those shots looked like at Lee Harvey Oswald with the 4-power magnification on the scope. I traced his steps from the time he left the depository until the time he was arrested. And some conspiracy theorists have alleged he didn't have time to get from point A to point B and point B to point C. I literally had my wife put me out of the rental car with a stopwatch and walked one of the distances to make sure that he indeed had enough time to do that. When I made that walk from his, from his boarding house room where he traveled immediately after the assassination to retrieve his pistol and jacket to the point where he shot and killed Dallas policeman J.D. Tippit. Many people have contended that he didn't have enough time to walk that point, 9 miles in roughly 15 minutes. Now, he was 24 years old and had just shot the president. I was at that time 42 years old and had not shot the president or anyone else. And I still made that brisk walk in about 13 minutes on my own. So I was so absorbed. That book I could almost write from my memory because of so much research I've done. So I would have to say that was the easiest of the books I've done. And then Buddy Holly being the hardest because it was, outside of my wheel zone, but it was also a place I wanted to go and learn more about.
So what would you say has been the most fun book to write? One that you've enjoyed the most?
I would have to say Buddy Holly again, though it was probably the hardest. I think it allowed me to learn so much more about music and about the somebody once said that Buddy Holly didn't invent rock and roll, but he brought the cradle of rock and roll, and he certainly did. And how influential he has been to subsequent artists and how many people have done their own versions of his songs, even to this date. Also let me do a fair amount of travel because I like to get the lay of the land when something's happened, and I wanted to, for example, in the Kennedy assassination, I wanted to ride in a convertible in the place where Kennedy was assassinated just to get the feel of the land. I wanted to be where Oswald killed Tippit. I wanted to be on the 6th floor museum because I had to bring those pictures to life and just need to have the lay of the land to be able, I think, to do your best writing.
Well, you did a wonderful job of it. I will attest to that.
Thank you.
So let's kind of shift over to just the mechanics and the logistics of how were you able, as a busy practicing psychiatrist, to carve out the time that you needed to write so many books?
Well, number one, better have a very patient wife, okay? And I have a loving and patient wife who allows me to pursue a full-time job as a physician and a part-time job as a writer. Number two, as I alluded to earlier, I look forward to the opportunity to write. That is not researching and writing is genuinely a pleasure to me. So whenever I can do that, it's not like I'm having to punch the clock and go to work. I'm craving the time to be able to do that. When do I write? Whenever I can. Probably my most productive times are early in the morning. I will typically get to my office a couple of hours before my first patient and do some writing then. I do a lot of writing on the weekends and the early morning when my wife and when my boys were still living at home or asleep, when it was just the dogs and I up. And then I find other times, you might have during the day a new patient cancel at the last moment and you have an hour that comes free. So, I'm very lucky. I can kind of, if I have my materials with me, I can research anywhere. If I have my laptop and my preparation notebook, I can write just about anywhere. I've written at my desk, in my study at home, in my desk at my office. I've written in airports. I've written on the back porch, the front porch. I don't have to have a designated writing spot. And a lot of writers that I've read about have talked about, they feel comfortable only being in one place and writing. And maybe it's because I don't know better, or I just was blessed to have that ability to be able to write anywhere. So, it's a matter of dedication. And when I do about one book a year now, and which usually takes anywhere from 6 to at most 9 months, then I take a break for 6 to 9 months, catch up on all my reading, let my creative energy kind of build back up again. So it gives me an opportunity to write and recharge. While I'm recharging, I'm trying to, as I do my reading, I'm often trying to say, okay, what do I want to write about next? And I often will run across a subject that fascinates me. And I think, I really don't think there's been enough written about this, or I would know more about it by now. So I tell people that, somewhat jokingly, that I consider writing to be about 20% talent and about 80% having a lead bottom, because you got to sit down and do it. And when I'm writing and researching, I write or research every day during that time, even if that means getting up early on Christmas morning and researching or writing for 30 minutes before everybody else does. Because think about this, if you write one page a day, guess what? At the end of the year, you got 365 pages. And it may not seem like much at that time, but if you write a page every day, you've got a manuscript or a book pretty much written. Now, then you go into the process of editing it, re-editing it yourself to get it just right. And I probably edit my own books 3 or 4 times because I'm so particular about my choice of adjectives and adverbs, because I want to paint these pictures with words. And I always think about what Mark Twain once said. He said the difference between the right word and the near right word is like the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. So I go through extensive editing myself before I then turn it over to my editor to go through it 2 or 3 times before we're ready to publish.
Well, if you had 2 minutes to give advice to a young physician who wants to pursue writing as their second profession, what would you say to a young physician or even a median physician or even someone like me who's getting closer to the end of the physician career? What can I still do as far as writing and enjoying that as a therapy?
Well, number one would be, do you have a passion for telling stories? Do you like to tell stories? Do you like to hear people tell stories? I think that's a must. That's number two. Can you find a way, find the discipline and the time to be able to do it? It is great fun for me to read, research, and write, but it is hard work. You have to, if you're a non-fiction writer, you have to be true to the facts. You have to do considerable research. You may find 3 accounts of one particular event through 3 sets of eyes, and they're all differing, and you have to try to reason which one would be the most accurate retelling that story, or try to combine elements that you think are accurate of all 3 accounts. So it is hard work, but, again, it's something I enjoy doing, and it does require discipline, and it's not something I could, say, write for 3 days and take a 3-week break and pick back up again. I think most writers will tell you they have to maintain that momentum. Now, luckily, if you're a full-time writer, you have a lot more hours to be able to do that. So I think you got to have a discipline, be willing to maintain the momentum. Then I think you got to figure out what you want to write about. Fiction is fun because you can make up whatever you want to, and you can craft your own storyline. And nonfiction, but again, being different, you got to be true to the facts. But if you can write it in a novelesque form, again, you can prove to your readership that fact is stranger and often more compelling than fiction. I guess I would add in, read as much as you possibly can, because that will open new creative avenues for you. It will also introduce you to new writers that may have become a significant inspiration for your style of writing or your particular genre.
Thank you. I guess I really admire number one that you stuck with this and your passion is so evident. And the main thing that I have a beef against you, Jeff, is that I had to wait 30 some years to find out that you were a writer. It wasn't until 2022 that I came across the first book, and I've enjoyed every single one of them since then. I'm looking forward to the next one that comes out. But
Well, I certainly appreciate all my readers, and you've been through no fault of your own, came to my stuff, but you've read everything, and I can't tell you how uh, appreciative I am. And for me as a hobby, certainly it's a hobby that generates a modest income. It's not an income that will allow me to quit my day job, but the most rewarding aspect are people who tell me, I never really liked nonfiction till I read your book, or I will get periodically emails from college and high school students who are writing essays or term papers and ask for me for permission to borrow from my books. And I've gotten some just absolutely sweet emails from couples now in their 80s who were at Buddy Holly's last concert and said, "You brought tears back to my eyes." So, and those are little things like that really make it all worthwhile.
well, you've really enriched my last couple of years, and I've enjoyed it. And I have a son that majored in English at the University of Virginia, and he started to like those books too. But you certainly have inspired me to look further. I appreciate the discipline, the enthusiasm. Can you give us any hints about what the next few topics might be about in new books?
Well, I'm actually working on a book right now. I'm back in the 6 to 9 month window. Writers are a little suspicious about sharing too much, but what I would share with people who might have interest, if you have a chance, Google the name William Rufus Devane King.
All right, I will.
Probably never heard of him, but he played a significant role in history and very interesting time or era in history, and some historical firsts that no one's ever done before.
I can hardly wait. You have a rough time frame of when that might be out?
My goal is usually to have them published somewhere around Thanksgiving each year. Even if I finish them 2 or 3 months early, I will kind of sit on it and wait to publish it, mainly just because to incentivize Christmas season sales. So
Exactly. Yeah.
because I don't have an agent, I'm my own marketer, which is by other people reading it and spreading it by word of mouth and through social media. So I think that explains why it took you 20 years to find out about that. And I'll take part of the responsibility of that, because we should have stayed in better touch through that time.
Yeah, I agree. But it's anything else. I feel like you've really shared a lot. I really appreciate this, Jeff, and I'm looking forward to the other books. I would encourage our listeners to consider recognizing how important and valuable having a second go-to and being able to write, to express themselves, whether it be in poetry and fiction or nonfiction. Thank you for the insights that you've given us, that it's never too late to start.
But I had one more thing, I think. It's sort of a unexpected offshoot of my writing that has made me a more effective psychiatrist. Having a knowledge of history has facilitated my connection with so many patients. For example, within the past year, seeing a new patient, I asked where she's born and reared, and she said, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I said, oh, the home of the Wheatland Mansion where James Buchanan lived. And, her eyes, pupils dilated, and said, how did you know that? And, her comfort level with me dramatically increased. And, I've been able to, with Vietnam veterans, to ask them, what years were you in the war and what battles you participated in and that sort of thing. And even years earlier, and they're still some of the World War II veterans. And it has allowed me, I think, to facilitate a closer, more therapeutic relationship with a lot of patients. And that was something I never really had thought about going into writing, but it has been a very beneficial offshoot from that.
It's even more outstanding that you've been able to tie those things together and recognize that being a good writer makes you a better psychiatrist, and being a psychiatrist certainly has some advantages for writing, whether it be a fictitious forensic psychiatrist like Dr. Sam Mitchell, or making and bringing history alive like you've done so well for so many topics. Again, I want to thank you, Jeff, and hopefully we'll have more of these conversations sometime in the future.
I would love to thank you again for having me.
Sure thing. How's that, Randy?
That was great. But especially in the ending part there, because I think that connectedness, we're trying to bring it back to helping clinicians today find something outside of the practice that they can connect to. We've got a gentleman doing a smart round at the end of next month that's talking about burnout. And he talks a lot. He lost a colleague that, just succumb to the stress of practice and handling patients because I don't think they had anything else. Or whatever it is that we fill our time with outside of work. Is it just with stuff, you know, television, social media, or do we have other things that we have passion for that give us purpose? I think that's the thing that seems to be missing is there's so much junk or calories that we can fill our psychology with, where if we really dug into something like that, I think the first, a lot of people will say, well, I don't have time. Actually, you do. It's just you fill it with other things. Like social media is a perfect example with my kids. It's like, put the phone down. Well, I was just going to, well, you've been there for an hour. You don't even realize you're there for an hour.
Wait, I see so many depressed patients, and one of the first things I tell them is limit your news watching to about 5 minutes a day, because if someone developed the cure for cancer, it would be the 5th story they ran on the news because they're going to have to talk about a school shooting or a presidential impeachment or something else. They would hide the story of the millennium and bury it 35 minutes into the broadcast because they want to present the sensational, which is often very traumatic and most often negative.
When it's repeated over and over and over again, and it's on your phone and it's on the TV and it's on the radio, and it's like you can't get away from it.
It's like when I watch a news station, they constantly running across the bottom caption, breaking news. I'm thinking, we having breaking news 24 hours a day. Breaking news used to be the president was assassinated, or we declared war on a foreign nation. It wasn't, it was one of those things that maybe happened once every 2 or 3 years. Now it's, we're having breaking news 24 hours a day or whatever. And that always amuses me how they caption that constantly.
Well, I've noticed too that the little breaking news it's what you said 30 minutes ago, or it's not anything that really anybody cares about. It just got your attention. And I think that going somewhere where historical or visiting a location and just being outside and and doing some reading and some studying about that stuff, you're completely removed from that. But I think that all that just consumes us now. You can't get away from it. As a kid, we never had these things. We went outside and you had to figure out something to do. And this is just like it's feeding you full of calories, and you're not doing anything physical. You're not using your brain or exercising your mind or anything. So a great story and a great hobby or passion or, life's work. I think that this is the type of thing people need to hear to keep our clinicians mentally healthy and strong. And, our healthcare system doesn't have it's a valuable resource. I look at things as a patient. And so I want a healthy healthcare system, and I want healthy clinicians and providers for my grandkids. So,
Exactly. And something I've discovered now being in my mid-60s and succumbing to the indignities of the aging process, how, often I blank for names and words, or how many times I go from room A to room B in my house and get to room B and what in the hell did I come in here to get? And I go back to room A and I remember it to go back. But I really believe our brain is much like a muscle, and if you don't use it, you lose it. And that is another, as I've gotten older, an added benefit. It keeps me engaged in the learning process and trying to tie the past and present together. So I think it has not only an emotional benefit for me, but I also think a cognitive benefit for me as well.
Dr. Leggett.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, you as well, Dr. Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Granny. Thank you, Jeff. We'll have to do this some other time, or Jeff, we'll just have to get together and talk some more.
We'll do it. I'd love to do that. Thank you for having me, and I will make sure that you're on the distribution list for everything I ever write. Okay.
All right. Well, it won't make up for 30 years, but at least it's a step in the right direction.
I'll start trying to recoup. I don't know if I'm got another 30 years worth of books, and I'll make as much headway as I can. Okay.
All right. I appreciate it.
All right.
Say hi to Ian for me.
I will. Same Angela. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for listening. Southern Medical Association is a 501c3 not-for-profit medical educational organization. Please consider supporting our mission by making a tax-deductible donation or by becoming a member. Visit sma.org to learn more.